Okay, so I want to quickly walk you through an overview of Trump's tariffs. We know they're so volatile, and I know you keep up on the news, but I thought we should start there to help level set. Then I want to move on to US Singapore Free Trade Agreement implications under the Trump regime. Then move to country of origin and de minimis, tariff codes, customs valuation, customs and border protection enforcement, and any mitigation and management considerations that you could take into account. So, looking at the current tariff landscape now, we see a lot of activity that's gone on. Really all started back in February when Trump initially came up with these IEEPA, or known as fentanyl tariffs, and he assessed a 10% tariff on all goods from China. And then about a month later, he added another 10%. Then he started with some sectorial tariffs, steel and aluminum. There are some goods on Canadian and Mexican imports as well. But what's really interesting to note here, and of course it's not on the slide, because why should my slide with the current tariff landscape be current? Um, Tariffs were up to 125% with China. They still are, but as of the 14th, both countries rather, have agreed to take a pause and drop that 125% down to 10% as a baseline. So that should be in effect for 90 days or so, and then we'll just have to wait and see what's going to happen. We also have the specific tariffs on automobiles and auto parts, and a reciprocal tariff of 10% on all nations. But it's looking like on July 9th that 10% could change, going as high as 50%. We'll see what happens. And of course, various other countries and trade blocs are pledging retaliation on the US. So, in terms of these reciprocal tariffs, they seem kind of scary, but there are some things that are excluded. For example, any goods that qualify for the US Mexico Canada agreement do not have to face any of the reciprocal tariffs. Same thing goes with steel and aluminum articles, auto parts, automobiles. I'm not going to go through reading this whole list, but you get the idea. I look next on target, though, in my opinion, will be semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. They are subject to future Section 232 tariffs. So we're playing that pretty closely because we're expecting to see some activity happening there. And one thing to point out on this slide, though, that I find really interesting is the second to last bullet point. The US tariff has two different columns. Column one are the most favored nation countries, and column two are countries that the US does not have great trade relations with. And currently it's Cuba, North Korea, Russia, and Belarus. What's interesting is the column two rates actually are lower than that 125% rate that the US has assessed on China. So when you look at how tariffs are layered, there's been a lot of questions in that space. I want to give you two different types of scenarios. Of course, looking at China and countries other than China. But of course, this is a little bit outdated, but it might come back to look this in this similar sort of way in the next 90 days or so. So this is for all products except the ones that aren't covered, like meaning those sectorial types of tariffs. So if you look at how things layer, first there's the MFN rate, which is the product specific rate. Then from China, you look at either a 7.5, 15, or 25% tariff. Then on top of that, we have the 20% fentanyl rates. Then there could be Section 232 rates on steel and aluminum or the automotive types of articles. And then finally, the retaliatory tariffs. So the way this works is at a minimum, if assuming, well, today that 125% is still in effect, but you would look at a minimum of 145% because worst or best case, you look at the retaliatory tariff and that fentanyl tariff of 20%. If everything else is free or not applicable, then you don't have to worry about that. When you look at most other countries, you're just looking at a minimum baseline tariff of 10%. So you could see, even in the case of Singapore, for example, that the tariff burden is not nearly as high as if a person is choosing to import from China. Of course, it'll be a little bit more level like tomorrow. And now if we look in terms of the non-covered products, and I like to look at pharmaceuticals as an example, there typically would look at from China the MFN rate, Section 301 if applicable, and the IEEPA fentanyl tariffs. So you're really looking at a minimum of 20% on those from China, and that still will apply actually as of May 14th. And then from other countries, all you're looking at is a product specific. So there's a big difference there of 20% off the bat. And just to give an example of layering the tariffs, how it looks from the real world. If we look at a leather golf bag that was made overseas, purchased for $150 each. I'm doing an example based on if it was made in China or based on Singapore. Again, that's based on the higher 125% tariff for now. So if the bag originates from China, it faces multiple tariffs. It has the general rate, the Section 301 rate, it has the IEEPA rate, it has the reciprocal China rate. So it's looking at 157% increase on tariffs. And if you look at how that breaks down, that's actually adding another $235.50 onto that $150 golf bag. So it's making it more than $385 if someone wishes to purchase it from China. But now let's look at the case of Singapore. There's a free trade agreement between the US and Singapore. So there is a free status. This particular product does qualify for free trade agreement benefits. And all you're looking at is a 10% baseline of 10%. So it's only adding $15 onto the cost. So you could see here that there's more than a $200 difference favorable to Singapore if you buy a Singaporean made good versus a Chinese one. So this is what a lot of people are starting to look at. And as companies, you could look at this too, starting to look at what the tariff burden might be sourcing from different countries. And you might land on the fact that Singapore ends up being the best option at the end of the day, simply because the US has that free trade agreement with Singapore. So what's on the horizon? We are looking at semiconductor, pharmaceutical, copper, and lumber article types of Section 232 tariffs. As of May 5th, we're kind of thinking that the pharmaceuticals might be next, coming by the end of this month. So stay tuned for more. And what does this mean for the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement? So first of all, if the US starts buying less Singaporean goods, there could be a negative adjustment to Singapore's GDP growth. And, as we look to, we see in general that tariffs are signaling a shift from a rules-based trade where people kind of operate under the World Trade Organization to kind of doing their own thing through executive order. And this risks a broader trade war. And I know Singapore is seeking exemptions, but so far the US stance suggests that that 10% baseline tariff is non-negotiable, but we'll see. I was pleasantly surprised last week when I saw Trump come to some sort of draft agreement with the UK. So it's possible that something beneficial will be on the horizon for Singapore. Now, we do think that Singapore will avoid retaliatory tariffs, meaning we don't think they're going to implement them on the US, but they might pursue some sort of WTO or other bilateral talks to try to remedy the situation. What this means in terms of Singapore is there could be an increased cost for electronics, chemicals, and other non-exempt goods when they're shipped to the US. And of course, we are already seeing a weakening US consumer demand. So there's a possibility for an order reduction, which means less exports. But the good news is Singapore does have a competitive edge. It has lower tariffs compared to other ASEAN peers. For example, Vietnam could go as high as 46% in July if Trump chooses to re-implement those country-specific tariffs. And this might lead to new investment, um, by multinationals seeking a regional base. In fact, I have one client that spent the last 2 years moving his supply chain to various Southeast Asian countries from China. He does have a Singapore hub, but he's starting to move some of the operations from countries like Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia to Singapore. So that is one of the glimmers of light that we're seeing here. So now I want to move on to country of origin, de minimis, tariff codes, and customs valuation. So really high level, country of origin means it's the country where a product is wholly obtained or substantially transformed. I think wholly obtained is pretty obvious. It's where goods are entirely produced in one country. All the raw materials come from one specific country. Then there's something known as substantial transformation, where a product undergoes a pretty large change in another country. I like to give the example of baking a cake. So if somebody's importing flour, sugar, eggs, and then they transform everything into a new product, a cake, that is a substantial transformation. There are certain ways to determine origin as well based on value add. If a certain percentage of a product's value is added in a specific country, that might make something qualify as well. A good rule of thumb there is around 35%, but it could change depending on specific rules because there are product-specific rules of origin in every free trade agreement, and they might vary from agreement to agreement and from country to country. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And the reason why origin matters is it determines the applicable tariffs. It also helps companies see if they could apply free trade agreement benefits as well as comply with them. And it does impact labeling requirements. So there is a concept of preferential versus non-preferential origin, and I believe Angelia will touch on this a little bit in her presentation as well, so I don't want to go too deep here. But preferential origin is what you really care about when you're looking to see if something qualifies for reduced or free tariff treatment under a free trade agreement. And it requires specific with certain rules under a specific agreement. So it could be local content, it could be regional value content, or even shifting from one tariff code to another. And non-preferential is just really for standard tariff rates under the World Trade Organization rules when there isn't a trade agreement in existence. So it really helps from the non-preferential origin side to assess the tariff rate and also help countries with statistical tracking for their trade data. So if we want to look in the example of the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, if somebody is looking to qualify a good based on something called a build-up method, which is one of the methods allowable in the free trade agreement, again, depending on the specific rules. So it could change product by product. But I'm giving an example here of a subassembly that has some circuit boards that are sourced in China, some chips that were sourced in Taiwan. They go to Singapore for assembly, testing, and packaging. And if we look at all the values here, right, the boards from China were $30, from Taiwan, the chips were $20, and then all the activities done in Singapore were $50. And if you look at that, the Singapore value is making up 50% of the total product value. And under this particular product, in the rules of origin, it says that there has to be substantial transformation in Singapore or a minimum regional value content of 35% from Singapore. So this particular subassembly qualifies based on a regional value content. But what's really important to remember here is you always need to maintain records to demonstrate qualification because it is possible for US Customs to approach a US importer and ask for information on how something qualified for the free trade agreement. And if the importer can't substantiate that it becomes an issue, and then goods get reassessed and they get penalties based on the non-preferential tariff rate. And there's a highly likelihood that that importer is going to come to you as a Singapore manufacturer asking for the documentation that proves that the product qualifies under the free trade agreement. And I want to give an example as well. There's something else of a build down sort of method, which isn't as common. But in this case, I'm giving an example of a fuel injection pump part. The value of that product is $30,500. There's $11,000 of non-originating materials. I've put the calculation here for you, but the rule of origin here is saying there needs to be a minimum regional value content of 35% using the build-up method and 45% using the build-down method. So what happens here is sometimes a product might not qualify under the build-up method. So then a company might choose to look at the build-down method. So the choice isn't really automatic. If both are allowed, start with one that might be easier to calculate, and if it doesn't work, then move on to the next one. Quite often, though, manufacturers might default to the build-down method if it aligns better with their accounting practices or their supply chain structure. So it really depends on what suits the business better. Just one thing to really note during the build-up method, it requires much more detailed documentation of originating materials. So you might need to get bills of material or supplier certificates of origin to help document things. So it becomes a little bit harder. And the build down method, you're just really subtracting non-originating costs rather than having to aggregate the originating ones. So again, you need to make sure that you document that a product does qualify. And then there is a de minimis content rule if nothing else works. In the case of the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, the threshold is 10% of the adjusted value for most goods. Typically, that's based on the ex works price or the transaction value. It doesn't apply to articles that are in chapters 1 through 23, so those are more like live animals, agricultural products, and some minerals, which likely don't impact you knowing where you're located. So it's really important to note that miscalculating or misapplying this sort of rule can lead to penalties or a loss of preferential tariff treatment. So it's very important to make sure that people don't just apply this willy-nilly. There needs to be good documentation to prove that a good would apply. And now we move on to one of my favorite topics, tariff code classifications. So just a quick overview on it in case you just need a little bit of a refresher is HS codes are used globally to classify traded goods, and they play a very important role in assessing duties. They link the duties based on the importing countries, and of course they trigger preferential rates under any free trade agreements. They also identify any specific restrictions like quotas or any additional taxes. So it's really important to make sure that you get the code right so you could calculate duties properly, including apply free trade agreement benefits. And quite often, misclassification not only leads to overpayment, but it could also lead to underpayment and penalties. And the penalties that US Customs assess are quite steep. They're like in the double digit, close to around 20%. They kind of assess the penalties based on tax codes, so they really aggregate and kind of pile up pretty quickly, particularly if there's an error like discovered quite a while away from when the goods entered the country in the first place. And now we move on to customs valuation. So just really high level, what valuation means is it's a process of determining the value of imported goods to assess customs duties and taxes based on. The primary method is transaction value, which is based on the price actually paid or payable of the imported goods, but it needs to be adjusted to include other costs. For example, buying commissions, royalties, licensing fees, and assists. It's preferred because it typically reflects the actual commercial transaction, but there are some cases when it can't be applied. For example, if there's related party shipments and there isn't a transfer price in place that demonstrates an arm's length transaction, or there could be instances when there are consignment shipments, particularly if people use toll manufacturing, or quite popular in the retail space or the food and beverage space, when companies might ship from one country to another and they're importing without a sale for export in the first place. So if you can use transaction value, you need to move down the hierarchy to the other goods. And if you just disqualify one by one until you get to the right one. But the next two in the hierarchy are the transaction value of identical or similar merchandise. Those are very difficult to prove because you need to have access to customs authorities' data to see what other goods that are pretty much a perfect match to what you imported work, and just looking at the tariff code alone isn't going to do it. And of course, you as an importer aren't going to have access to the general customs import information. Then you can move down to something like deductive value, which is a build up method, and computed, or a build down method, excuse me, and computed value, which is a build up method. You're allowed to actually switch those in the hierarchy if one is more favorable than the other. And then there's a fallback method. If none of these work, you could kind of work with a customs authority to come up with something that's a hybrid of all of them. And why does customs valuation matter, particularly now? I've never worked on so many customs valuation products throughout my career. It's because if you could come to the lowest and justifiable customs value, you reduce the tariff burden because you're establishing a lower cost basis that the tariffs are assessed on. And of course, it also ensures compliance. A lot of companies before, even with related party shipments, didn't really care about the value before when they're dealing with free trade agreement environments because there wasn't a tariff burden, but now all of a sudden it's a big deal. So it's really important to even think about strategic transaction restructuring. There are instances when a company might be importing, there isn't a sale for export, but they happen to use the wholesale price as the import value. But if they could change things around to maybe act as a non-resident importer or insert a US related party if they have one, for example, to act as the importer of record, they could use like a middleman type of price that's lower and also lower the cost basis that the tariffs are assessed on. So this is a really amazing tool that a lot of people can get a lot of value out of. We're seeing really great results these days. I mean, and sometimes it's a minimum of 20% reduction, but in some cases lately, we're even seeing 60%. So it could be pretty impactful. So the way we look at reducing this burden, and I know I started to talk about it a little bit on that last slide, is there are strategies for both deductive and computed value. Deductive value isn't used as frequently because if you don't know what the resale price is on goods on the importing country, it might be hard to work with. So it starts as the basis, looking at the resale cost of goods in the importing country, and then it starts backing out a bunch of costs like commissions, duties, the transportation, value add during resale. It even backs out the raw material costs. It goes all the way back to the beginning. And the strategy here that people could deploy is to restructure sales, to document resale prices and the allowable deductions. And I've listed here some good candidates. For example, distributors or retailers with clear resale chains, consignment or intracompany transactions, goods that might be resold in an importing country, or places where there are high post-importation costs. And the benefit here is it excludes the post-importation costs, which helps to reduce the dutiable value. It does require very robust records of resale prices and deductible costs. And one thing I didn't put here too is US Customs requires companies to reevaluate the deductive value every 90 days. So it's quite burdensome to administer. And then if you look at computed value, that's the build up method where you start looking at raw materials, production costs, general expenses, and profit margins, among other things, to build up to come to a particular cost. And you really need to have the detailed cost breakdowns, of course. And some good candidates here are manufacturers that import from a subsidiary. And the reason why I say the subsidiary is because they're going to be more willing to share all the production and raw material costs. If you're dealing with an unrelated party, they might not be willing to share that information as much because they might be nervous that you're going to accuse them of price gouging or something like that when you see their profit. So it's a little bit harder to work with when you're not dealing with a related party. And then, of course, there's the consignment or intercompany transactions, again, are very popular. And imports where the production costs are well documented. So again, this does lower the value quite significantly. So some transaction restructuring tips here, or you might want to look to separate non-dutiable services and contracts, because in the US, international freight and insurance is not dutiable. So that might be something to ask your business partners to break it out. If they're listed as separate line items on invoices, you could deduct those charges. So it's really important, of course, to maintain clear documentation for the costs and any resale prices. So now for the fun part, enforcement. So we're seeing quite often, first of all, I wanted to give you some roles. Customs and Border Protection is the primary enforcer of the customs laws. They use something called the automated commercial environment to detect any anomalies. 100% of all imports, even the low value shipments, must be filed through this particular system. So customs, through AI and other enforcement tools and like technology, are able to see if there are any anomalies. And then they collaborate in some cases with the Department of Justice for civil and criminal investigations into tariff evasion. So it's a really big deal. We are seeing a lot of fraud investigations, and the target areas seem to be country of origin. I actually just had one land on my desk today for circumvention, where companies sometimes misrepresent origin. For example, they're going to transship goods that come from China through Vietnam to avoid higher tariffs. Then other areas might be misclassification, where companies might knowingly or unknowingly use the incorrect tariff code to secure lower duty rates. And then, of course, undervaluation. I see this quite often, and it drives me bananas. If someone says, hey, I'm going to charge you $50, even though the product is $100, and I'll send you a bill after the fact, and don't worry about including that in your customs value. That's totally illegal. That can't be done, right? False invoices are definitely a no-no. So we are seeing an increase in False Claims Act cases that are driven by whistleblowers, usually people that are inside the company. And we've seen in fiscal year 2024 that 423 new False Claims Act investigations were initiated. So there are pretty hefty fees. I don't want to read through this whole slide for you. You'll be getting handouts, so you could check it out later on. But there are civil penalties under the False Claims Act, as well as customs administrative penalties that could be pretty steep, including the suspension of import privileges or loss of free trade agreement program benefits. And then, of course, criminal penalties. There was a recent example of a Florida couple being sentenced to 5 years in prison for evading $42 million in plywood duties. So it could be pretty steep here. And I just wanted to walk you through a case study of an FCA violation. So there was a US-based computer hardware manufacturer that was importing components for laptops and servers. They operate a global supply chain with their assembly taking place in Southeast Asia. So what happened here is The company misrepresented the country of origin to evade 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. At the time, that's what the tariffs were for them. They labeled the components as originating from Malaysia, but they were really, for the most part, sourced from China and transshipped. And they also falsified certificates of origin and invoices to mislead CBP. So they also misclassified the high value server processors under lower tariff codes that reduced the duty from 5% to 0%. And they also undervalued the invoices, understating the component values by 30%. So they actually reduced their duties just on the customs value alone by $12 million over the 2 years. So this is quite a great case because they've done everything here, from country of origin fraud to misclassification and valuation fraud. So what happened is here, a whistleblower triggered this investigation. It was jointly investigated by CBP and the Department of Justice. They used the ACE data and supplier audits to uncover the fraud. And earlier this year, there was a settlement of $36 million in treble damages, which was 3 times the $12 million in underpaid duties. And then there was $1.2 million in per claim fines for 84 invoices worth. So they do assess fines based on every single occurrence of the error, not just the one that they originally start working on. So lessons learned here, kind of a no-brainer. It's really important to have supply chain transparency and accurate certificate of origin documentation, and even for companies to have robust internal audits to make sure that there aren't tariff misclassifications and invoice fraud, because you never know, sometimes there might be some shenanigans that people don't know about. Companies might have a really robust trade compliance program in place, but maybe somebody in sales or somebody in purchasing is doing something on the side that they don't know about. So these internal audits are really crucial. And now my favorite part is mitigation considerations. We already talked about valuation, so I don't want to touch upon that again, as well as classification, really. Reclassifying, look to find a better classification that has a lower tariff rate, but of course not picking a code because it has a lower tariff rate. And then there's something called tariff engineering, where maybe if someone has a subassembly, they could ship the parts all as standalone, and maybe each of those components ends up having a lower tariff rate, or the aggregate of all those separate components ends up having a lower tariff rate or tariff burden really at the end of the day. Looking at country of origin, is there a way to leverage free trade agreements like that one client of mine starting to move more goods into Singapore as opposed to Malaysia, Laos, and Vietnam? Can he transform things enough to make something even be considered Singapore origin, even if it might not qualify for the free trade agreement? And then looking at special programs like temporary imports, bonded operations, foreigner free trade zones, and duty drawback. So in the next slide, I'm going to get into each one of those in a little bit more detail. So bonded warehouses are a place where importers can bring in dutiable merchandise and in the US store it without payment for up to 5 years without having to pay any tariff. So the duty is deferred until merchandise is withdrawn for consumption, or if, let's say, the US is being used as a regional hub for North America and South America even, if goods are removed immediately from that bonded warehouse and exported directly from the US, they avoid tariffs altogether. You're not allowed to do any manufacturing in there, but you could do some light manipulation. And then moving on to the foreign trade zones, that's what I like to think of as a bonded warehouse on steroids, because it allows those same benefits, but you can leave the goods there for an indefinite period of time, and you can do manufacturing. It also helps to significantly reduce customs fees that are added on top of the tariff burden, because people could pay for them maybe monthly instead of on a per shipment basis. Duties are permanently eliminated for any waste, scrap, or rejected products that might happen to materialize while in the zone. And there's also federal excise and state and local inventory tax benefits. While materials are sitting in a foreign trade zone, they do not have to pay any of the local inventory taxes. So that's another benefit. And then we move on to some special tariff provisions that could help to reduce tariffs and support free cash. So one of those is a temporary import bond. The catch here is if a company knows that 100% of the goods on a particular shipment they're importing will ultimately be exported back out of the country after manufacture or light assembly, they can apply for a temporary import bond. It's very simple to do. All the company would need is a bond rider, and then off they go. There's something else that's a prototype provision that could be applied to R&D materials and clinical materials in the pharmaceutical space. This provision applies across the board. It doesn't just have to be for pharmaceuticals, but I happen to use it a lot in that space. Any articles that might be shipped from the US overseas for assembly, repairs, or testing and then returned, there's a possibility to just pay the tariffs and the value add that's overseas. And similarly, if let's say a company imports some bottles from China and they ship them up to Canada for further processing and then they bring them back into the US, since they previously paid tariffs on those Chinese origin products, they don't need to double pay. They could use a special tariff provision and not have to pay a second time. And then finally, there's duty drawback that allows for a 99% refund of any tariffs paid for goods that are imported and subsequently exported or destroyed under customs supervision. So that could be for manufacturing, or it could be for rejected materials. There's an even trading drawback. If there's a different importer and exporter, and there's this middleman drawback broker in the middle that could kind of help broker things, that's another newer strategy that's been around maybe for 10 years. I think it is exactly 10 years now, that has gotten a lot of traction because a lot of companies can now benefit from drawback who couldn't before because they didn't have access to the import or export records or vice versa. So some considerations that I just want to leave you with here is things to really look at are if you have a multi-country supply chain, there likely is some way to mitigate the tariff burden. Looking at imports of raw materials, finished goods, or capital equipment, China sourcing, of course, is a big deal. I still am thinking that there will be a bit of volatility there, at least in the short term. If you have substantial annual tariff spend, dealing with R&D, decentralized operations is another good one. People might not be taking advantage of things the way they are because there might be, in some facilities, people have really great trade knowledge and others they don't. If you're importing goods that might later be exported, transfer pricing adjustments, of course, and global planning structures like contract and toll manufacturing, which I know Singapore is a really big place for that. So there are ways to maybe partner up with your business partners already to see if there might be ways to mitigate the burden. So thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to hearing your questions. And if you want to reach out to me separately, please feel free to do so.